All right, we're come to our last of our series of studies on leadership. We'll get to that here in just a second. Next week, we begin our new trimester. We begin in Genesis on Wednesday night, and then the following Sunday, not this coming Sunday, but the following Sunday, we start in Matthew. And I'll remind you again, which we've mentioned several times, there is an alternative adult class meeting in the back here. We can accommodate 15 to 20 in that class. Dan Duggan will be teaching Genesis. Ricky Bruce will be teaching Matthew. If you want to be a part of that, you can see those men about any handouts. If they do have handouts, I don't know. But the handout you just received is for this class starting next week. Now let's get underway with our questions on leadership, or our study of leadership. And our study tonight focuses on what do I do to prepare to lead. I'll remind you of for one last time, what our goal and our purpose in this series, the elders had in mind of trying to develop future leaders, both in the immediate future and distant future, and also help prepare wives for their husbands to be leaders, what's involved there, and for the rest of us to understand what leadership involves. Come January 5th, we'll make some more detailed announcements about this, but part of the purpose here of this study is to help us get some information together so that we might look out among us and suggest some men who may be potential elders within the next 1 to 5, 5 to 10 years in two different brackets. Those are the numbers we've tweaked a little bit. We'll go with 1 to 5, 5 to 10. More about that on January 5. But be thinking about that, who you might suggest. And so we want to talk tonight about what do I do to prepare. But I want us to go to our scenario first. And we'll go there, and because often we get to the end and we kind of get crunched, and we can't push this off to another week. So let's go to our scenario first, and we're going to go in reverse order in that, and then we'll come back and work our way through our prepared material. And so our scenario is, this is our last one, you're one of the elders, and due to a need for a new auditorium, the elders have announced a new building program giving details of the building and the price. This is not a surprise announcement. The elders have asked for input from the church for months before plans were finalized. Two families complain seriously about the price. How do you resolve this? Quite often it has been said, I think correctly so, that there are 3 periods that are very trying for a church: selecting a preacher, selecting elders, and building a building. If a church can make it through those, then it's a pretty stout church. And some churches come apart in selecting a preacher, selecting elders, and in building a building. So this could be a touchy circumstance. What would you do? You're one of the elders. What else? What would you do? Okay. Yeah, if this is a case where they've waited a while to make some kind of suggestion or raise a question, the question is why? That's a good question to raise. What else would you say? How would you handle this? Okay, good question. It may be somebody that has specific knowledge of building, or it may be they have a lack of knowledge concerning building and prices. We'll come back to that a little bit later. So why are they making those statements? Shannon?
I think talking to the people that are having an issue about the price, I want to know more details from them. What specifically is their complaint? Are they concerned that we won't be able to then, as a congregation, to evangelize? Are we going to be hurting ourselves elsewhere in the budget? Specifically, what is the issue? Because just saying that they have an issue with the price, are they cheap? Do they feel that, we're just wasting our money? Or are we doing this with the right intentions for being able to house more people so that we can see the growth quantitatively? Are we trying to get more people here? Is there a need? Are we busting at the seams? And is that why they're concerned about the price? discuss with the other elders and let them know this is the concern. This is specifically the people's issue with it, not just they say it's too much money. And then from there, if there's an issue that needs to be addressed with their willingness to follow. I mean, last week we talked about followership, right? Not just leadership. We talked about followership. And if this has been discussed for quite a while, then we need to maybe approach those people to discuss. If the elders are all in agreement, we see that you have an issue with followership because we've been working on this for quite some time now.
Good observation. Very good. We'll come back to some of that here in a minute. Good. Maybe. That may be.
Like Shannon was talking about growth. I mean, do you need to build a giant auditorium or do you need smaller auditorium?
Yeah.
What do you need?
Yeah, that's a good point. What is the concern here? I think from the scenario that's been put out so far, we don't have enough information yet till we gather more information. So that part is good. What else would you do?
You're always going to have issues, as we talked about before. Anytime you make a decision, anyone that's in an authority position to make a decision, people are going to question it. People are going to go against it at some point, even if they don't, get publicly vocal about it. They're going to go against it. And yes, there's not enough information, but for them to wait till the last minute, there's probably another issue that needs to be got to the bottom of.
Good point. Very well could be.
The way you've got that worded, you say two families complain seriously about the price. You don't say two families came to the elders and said that we discussed the price. If they're just sitting back and complaining, they're not being constructive in what they're doing. And there's something else there that needs to be addressed as well. And another issue is, there are timing matters that elders have to consider as well as people in the congregation. Because, for example, right now, to do work on the building, the materials are gonna cost a whole lot more because what happened in North Carolina needs to be. And the materials are needed in those directions, and maybe the timing might not be good for a congregation to be doing something when the materials are needed there. So those kind of things have to be kind of thought through too.
A lot of questions have to be asked. What else? Take another minute or two, and then we'll wrap some things up.
In this scenario, it says the elders have asked for it. So I don't know if the complaining is going to the elders or is it complaining amongst
Yeah.
other members of the congregation. That's two different
Yeah.
things. So if you can ask for them to do it and they're complaining, okay.
Yeah.
But if you're hearing back talking to the congregation, that's something else.
And maybe that should be clarified. In this scenario, this is the complaints brought to the elders. This is too expensive. We're overdoing it.
I think one thing we need to consider too is, especially today for us sticker shock. I mean, all we have to do is look at what vehicles cost. You walk out and see a sticker. The same thing might be applicable in this case. That may be the going rate by construction companies, so much per square foot. And they have to just be educated, that's what it costs.
Yeah, it's not always cheap. One more. Let's get one more comment here.
It needs to be taken seriously, not just dealt with like, well, we made the decision, it's over. Because there have been churches that have split over small things like carpet and wall painting. So it has to be addressed seriously and with good leadership.
Good point. Let's start with that. Let me wrap some things up here because we've got a number of things to get to. Let's start with that comment. This has to be something we can't ignore. You can't just say, we've made a decision, that's it. We're going forward with it, because this is a very volatile situation that could lead to bigger division and problems over little matters. The building's too big, it costs too much, we don't like the color paint, etc. Starting with that, I've listed here 2 or 3 things that overlap with what we've just heard. We need to see, as Shannon pointed out, what the problem really is. Is it the size? Or they don't think we need the building? And more likely, they're not going to understand the price of building. Very few people understand the price of building. And you'll have sticker. I've been involved in enough building, and yet I'm shocked sometime when I get a bill, that the concrete is like $250 a yard now. And within the same building project, it'll go up $50 a yard before you can get the next job poured. So they may not understand the building materials expense. They may not realize commercial buildings cost more. They may not realize it costs more to build in in the city than in the county. Or in this county is more expensive than another county because of some of the codes. They may not understand all of that. I might ask them, do you think it could be done cheaper? And if so, how? Because they may have some insight. It may be somebody that's built before. I don't mean that they're a contractor. I mean that they may have built some commercial building. Maybe a guy that owns some property. And he may have some insight. Okay, tell us what we can do different and how we can save some money. And so I might ask them, what is the solution? What do you think the solution is? Because if we don't build the building, then we're going to have other people complaining. What would you do? I would ask them. Does that make sense? Reverse the situation with them. What if we decided not to build the building and these other people are complaining that our money's not being spent for the building like we thought? How would they handle that? And so here's the point we need to learn, we're going to move on, that you can't ignore questions like this, even though it's a judgment call. The elders need to show good faith in trying to work with them by asking questions, trying to work with them. But ultimately, when a call is made, a judgment call is made, some are not going to be happy and we have to go with that judgment call. And as Shannon said, we may have to work with what it means to follow when only 2 families out of 150 people are complaining about the price, and they may not have a clue about pricing. That quite often, as Ricky said, the shock of price, sticker shock, and they don't have a clue what things cost. Make sense? All right. Those just give us a taste of what leaders have to deal with, and so let's go back to number 5 and get underway here. Let's talk about a challenge. Men, even down to teens, need to think seriously about being elders in the future. And I would encourage every young man from the time they're teens, they ought to be thinking about, I want to be qualified someday to be an elder. And we'll come back to 1 Timothy 3:1 in just a moment. And so I ask every man who's not serving as an elder, who thinks you may be potential elder in the future, to think about this. Ask yourself, how would I be as an elder? Would I do a good job as an elder? Would my family life hinder me? Would something I'm doing now, something I'm practicing, I'm not talking about sinful things, but is there something I'm doing that would hinder my influence so that people may not think of me as a leader? And what if my name come up? Would there be objection somehow? Would somebody raise an objection? Well, you're a good guy, but I'm not sure you're elder material because, and what would they say? We're going to deal with some of that later question in just a moment. So what this lesson is about is encouraging you to work hard, make some changes, listen to advice, set your goals, so that when the time comes and your name goes forward, there are no objections. That should be the goal. Now, let's go to 1 Timothy 3 and in verse 1. The office of an elder is one that men should desire. I think we sometimes take a guy who states publicly or let it be known, I desire to be an elder someday, as if that's a negative thing. Well, he's kind of campaigning to be an elder. And that shouldn't be our attitude, because that's what we want to see in him. I want to be an elder someday. I want to qualify. I desire the office. This text says it's a faithful saying, if a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. You ought to desire it. If a man said, I don't desire it, would you appoint him as an elder? I don't think so, because he ought to desire it before he could be appointed. And so he ought to desire that. Women ought to also not desire to be elders, but for their husbands to be elders. And so our question for tonight is, what kind of advice could we give? What kind of encouragement, instruction, direction could we give one that is a potential elder? May not be qualified today, but what do we say to them to make them go in that direction? That's what this study is about. So let's get underway. First of all, we would tell them, this is quite obvious. We would tell them they ought to be faithful. Would you agree? You want to qualify to be an elder? Just live a diligent, faithful, godly life, and you're well underway qualifying yourself to be an elder. Now, the reason for that is because everyone's required as a Christian to be faithful. We're to be faithful unto death. That's an obvious passage. Let's talk about some passages that deal with priority. Matthew 6:33, who can quote that? Seek. All right, very good. Yeah, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Let's talk about what that passage is talking about. It's in the context of worrying about your daily needs, your daily necessities, and you're worrying about food, clothing, and shelter, etc. And the text says seek. That means to strive after, to covet earnestly. It's something you really want. You're not just kind of going in that direction. You're going at it hard. And what we're to seek is the kingdom of God. I'm convinced that expression is used in several different ways in the New Testament, one of which is for God to rule in our heart. Where God rules, the territory is in your heart. And so seek for God more than anything else to rule first. So the place we're to give it is top priority. Top priority. So the first and foremost thing that we should be doing is striving for God to rule in my life. Now that's seeking first the kingdom of God. Now here's another passage, Matthew 16:24. What does Matthew 16:24 say? If a man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow after me. This was in the context of Peter thinking about himself. Remember, Jesus told him in essence that you're focused on yourself and not on me. When Jesus had said what would happen to him, and Peter said it wasn't going to happen. You remember that? And Jesus points out, you're thinking about yourself. So to be a disciple, we must say no to ourself, is the point of this passage. And then we bear the cross and then we follow. Here's the point. Self and our own desires need to be pushed back. Here's what I want. Here's my desires, but you push those back. This is just a lesson on faithfulness. The first part of this is that we all need, whether you're going to ever be an elder or not. And so put first things first. Deny yourself. Here's another passage, Matthew 8:22. There was a man who Jesus said, come and follow me. And he said, but first let me go bury my father. And Jesus' response was, let the dead bury the dead. All right. Context of following after Christ. But first, here was a man who made the plea, let me go see to something else or someone else first. His father in this case. Now, what was his father dead? I don't know. Or was his father still living? I don't know. Let me go see to that first. But Jesus didn't think much of the plan. So here's the point. Nothing should stand in the way of our service to God. Now, if we stopped right there, we've had a good lesson tonight from those three principles. Would you agree? We're not through. Let's look at 1 Peter 5. Elders are to be what? Examples to the flock. Very good. And so how can they be examples if they themselves aren't diligent and faithful? Well, without reading the details, 1 Corinthians 15:58 said, be ye steadfast, always bounding in the work of the Lord. That's dedication, that's devotion, that's steadfastness. 2 Peter 1, add to your faith, virtue, knowledge. There's twice in that text it says, giving all diligence, add to your faith. Put every effort you have into that. Now, here's a point that's sad, but it's true. I don't think anyone can disagree with this. That there are many men in the church that will never be elders simply because they did not make spiritual matters a priority. Would you agree? This is lesson number 17. Up and down. Yeah, I like that too. That'll work. Up and down, yes. Back and forth, no. Yeah. Makes sense? Would you agree with that? Yeah, there's many men who could be elders as far as maybe their knowledge, or maybe they have some judgment, but spirituality is just not a priority to them. And so they're not hitting it hard, and they never are going to be elder material. You don't even think of them as elder material. Their name won't even surface as potential. Make sense? All right, let's go further. Here's the second thing I would tell the person. Work toward a family that fears God. Would you agree with that? So you start even before you even get married, and you work toward a family that fears God. So my first thing would be tell them, that young man who's a teenager, you want to be an elder? Be careful who you marry. Why would I tell him that? All right, yeah. Who you marry makes a big difference. And this is from a lesson on marriage, so I'm not going to go through every detail. But do you remember in Exodus 34, Deuteronomy 7, they were told not to marry the people of the land? So it tells you it makes a difference who you marry. Ezra 9, they married the people of the land. That was identified as being the problem. That was sinful. They were told to separate, and they said they would do. Painful circumstance. See, it made a difference who you married. What about Solomon? His wives did what? Caused him to sin. Nehemiah chapter 13. Mark 6, Herod was told his marriage was unlawful. Made a difference who he married. 1 Peter 3, here's a woman married to a non-Christian man. Wasn't told it was wrong, but she's greatly concerned about his spiritual well-being because she loves him. But he's not a Christian. Made a difference who she married, didn't it? Made a difference who she married. That's all we're trying to drive at here. All right? An elder's wife must be faithful. Where would I find that Bible principle? Titus or 1 Timothy? 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 11. Even so the wives must be grave, not slanderous, sober, faithful in all things. We've talked about that already. So since that's the case, he wants a family that fears God. You see, the family of the elder, of an elder, is very important because both the wife and the children are mentioned in the qualifications. And how he deals with the family reflects his leadership skills, doesn't it? Kind of wife she ends up being. Is she kind of out of control? Does she kind of rule the roost? Are his children out of control? All right, then that suggests maybe he's not qualified, or vice versa. Elders' children must be faithful. We're not going to go through that qualification again because we've talked about that already. I'm just simply demonstrating why he needs a family that fears God. So I'm interested in point 3 here. As you are rearing your children, think about what you teach your children by precept, by example, and by toleration. That ties with our Sunday morning study. Think about what you're teaching them by what you're allowing them to do, because that has everything to do with whether or not you may be qualified in the future. Does that make sense? Has everything to do. You tolerate things, and now they're off doing things that are going to disqualify you. Or maybe you taught them some bad things by example, etc. Again, I say there would be many men who will never be elders simply because of their family. That's sad. That's not anything that we're glad about. That's just simply saying there are men whose name won't be on the radar because of their children, maybe because of their wives. All right, here's a third thing. Would you agree we ought to tell him to study the Word? You want to be an elder in the future? Yeah. Why would you tell him that? All right. Yeah, elders need to study, and the reason for that is all Christians need to do that. He needs to do that just to be a faithful Christian, doesn't he? So we won't take the time to notice every detail, but like 2 Peter 3:18, grow in the grace and in the knowledge. Acts 17:11 gives an example of what the Bereans do. Daily. And in Hebrews chapter 5, they were rebuked because they should have been teachers by now and they were not. Elders are to feed the flock, whether they're doing the actual teaching, which they need to do some, or they're seeing that the teaching is done. How do they know what teaching needs to be done if they don't know the Word itself? So they need to know the Word because they're to feed the flock. They also must be ready to rebuke the false teacher, Titus 1 in verse 9. There may be maybe the preacher that teaches error, and they need to be ready to stand and say, that's wrong, and here's why that's wrong, and defend the truth. That's their job. All right? They need to be ready to talk to members about their soul. May not be a public class. It may just be going and talking to sister so-and-so about her soul or brother so-and-so about his soul, because that's their job, watching for souls. And they don't go and just give advice. They're going to give some scripture. You need to change some ways because, and here's the passage. He doesn't need to have to take the preacher along and cite the passages for him. He needs to be able to cite those himself. Make sense? That's why he needs to study. All right, let's talk about what he needs to study. What would you tell him? He says, well, I need to study. What do I need to study? Don't just say the Bible. Let's be a little more specific. All right, you need to know what the scriptures say about church discipline. That's good. Say again. Current false doctrines. We'll come back to that. Hermeneutics. He needs to know how to interpret the scriptures. Well, exactly. Just knowing the truth don't mean you know how to defend it. How to answer the errors. How do you answer that argument on imputed righteousness from Romans 4, 2 Corinthians 5? Those are tough. Need to study up. Get ready. What else? Yeah, need to know how to recognize those. Very good. I put here simply needs to know the text in its context. That's what 2 Peter 3 implies. And verses 16 to 18, you need to know the text in its context to ensure you're not going into apostasy. And so if he wants to ensure that the church is not going, he needs to know the text in context. That's not all he needs to know. He needs to know the wisdom literature. He needs to know what the wise approach is. He needs to know how to deal with people. A classic example is Proverbs 18:13, Proverbs 18:17. Verse 17 says, he that is first to defend his cause seems until his neighbor comes and examines him. Yeah. In other words, there's two sides to the story. If he understands that principle, he's not going to jump to conclusions. So he needs to be familiar with wisdom literature. And as just mentioned a moment ago, he needs to know the issues of the day. And I give the example of circumcision in the first century. Can you imagine a first century elder not knowing the arguments being made on circumcision? How it's binding today, et cetera, and how to answer that? Because that's infiltrating the churches. And so you say, well, we don't have circumcision as an issue today. No, but we've got other issues. We need to be familiar with what's going on. Make sense? Get familiar with what's going on if you want to be an elder. All right, let's talk about communication skills for a moment. I'm not going to get through this whole section. I have a number of things in this. I don't think I will. But communication skills are very important for an elder. We've talked about communication in one whole lesson. Why are communication skills so important for an elder? All right. Have to be tactful. Very good. You want to be clear and concise in your communication.
Can help to handle problems because it can help you to not be misconstrued. If you have poor communication skills, what you say may not be heard the way you intended by the hearer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, very, very important to have communication skills. He must have the ability to teach, 1 Timothy 3. We've already seen that, so that means he's got to have some communication skills. And so he needs to learn to be careful. We won't notice every one of these. Let's look at a sampling from each one of these sections I'm about to mention. It's important that what I say to and about others is carefully worded and carefully chosen. Someone get Proverbs 10:19 and just read that if you've got it before me. All right. Yeah, here, a man who, if in a multitude of words, sin is unavoidable. In other words, there's going to be a problem the more you say. You're not careful what you say, there's going to be problems. Here's another category of things. How I choose my words are important. Proverbs 12:18, who's got that? While you're looking for that, I'm going to go into Proverbs 15:1. We'll come back to 12:18. Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath and a harsh word stirs up anger. How you choose your words has everything to do with how the outcome is. Now Proverbs 12:18, who's got that? All right, very good. I need to be careful lest I say something detrimental. Look at Proverbs 11:9. And while you're turning there, I will jump ahead and get verse 23 of Proverbs 15. And that is the timing. It may not always be what I said or how I said it. It may be the timing of that. Proverbs 15:23 says, a man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good it is. Properly timed. This is the right time. Another time may not be the right time. 11:9, who's got that?
With his mouth the godless man will destroy his neighbor, but by knowledge the righteous are delivered.
All right, very good. He needs to think before he speaks. Proverbs 15:28 talks about the righteous studies how to answer. I think we sometimes think that means that you study how that you're going to respond to error or what is contrary to the will of God. I think this includes that, but it includes just how am I going to respond to something that was just asked of me? How do I respond to something that was just said? What tone do I use? Think before we speak, in other words. We need to speak so that we're understood, so that we're not misunderstood, and not be vague. Be concise. That's part of the skills of a leader. Make sense? You want to be a leader? Think about how you speak. Now, use tact and caution as you approach. Proverbs 15:1 talks about how the soft answer turns away wrath, but at the end of that, the mouth of fools shows forth foolishness. 25:11, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and the settings of silver. Make sense? All right. 3 people think it makes sense. Let's talk about how tact and approach, how we approach people and circumstances make a difference. Our approach can prevent problems. That's what Shannon was just mentioning a moment ago. If we approach a person in the right manner, we just prevented some problems, or we may have created more problems. More about that in a second. And so how we speak is as important as what we speak. Let me skip that section. I want to go to this one right here. This is from a study on marriage. I pulled this out of a study on marriage, of how poor communication, this is the thing that several of you have mentioned already, poor communication skills can create problems you didn't already have. And elders can do that. As leaders, they're trying to communicate, and they may give the wrong message when they didn't intend to. And what we mean by that, this is how communication fails. There is what you meant to convey or say, and that's different from what you actually said. And that's different from what another heard you say. And that's different from what others think about what they heard you say, and then what another thinks about what he heard you say, and then what you think about what another thought he heard you say. That's getting confusing, isn't it? Let me show you how that works. Here's what I meant to say. I meant to say about Brother So-and-so that he is so much smarter than I am, I don't know enough to teach him anything. That's actually praising him for his greatness and his intelligence. That's what I was trying to say. But what I actually said was, I can't teach him anything. See, that could go across the wrong way, couldn't it? Because what someone heard me say, I didn't actually say it, but what they're hearing is, he's not teachable because he won't listen. And here's what somebody thinks about that. They think, what arrogance. He sure is quick to judge and misjudge another. Now we've got some friction going on. And when they make that statement about me, here's what I think. I think you're making up charges about me. Why are you doing that? And nobody knows where the confusion came from. Because the elder is thinking, I just said, he's so much smarter than I am, but that's not what he said. What we're thinking and what we're saying sometimes are different things. Make sure you develop the skill to communicate what you're thinking. Make sense? Very, very important as a leader. All right, anything else on communication skills? Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Good point. Good point. Let's talk about seeking wisdom. Why is seeking wisdom important? Why is there a need for a leader to have wisdom? Make wise choices. Seek the wisdom of God. That's good. All right. Good point. The need for wisdom is that we might know more than just right and wrong, but we might know good judgment. Would you agree? I think that's what Colossians 1 and 9 is about. Colossians 1 and verse 9, Paul's prayer for the Colossians was that they would be filled with the knowledge of his will. I got that. I know what filled with the knowledge of his will is, but he added something to that, in all wisdom and spiritual understanding. So what is that? Well, I like what, he may not be right, but I think he was right. Walton Weaver, Brother Weaver said in his commentary, he said it doesn't take all wisdom and spiritual understanding to know the difference between right and wrong or the good or the bad, but it does require such wisdom and understanding to know the better over the good and the best over the better, and having recognized the difference to make the best choice rather than just refuse the bad. I think he's got a point. I think he's got a real good point. Here's how that works. I think sometimes we think there's two categories. There's sin, and then there's the good and right. So here's something people have decided to do, decision or an action, and since it doesn't involve sin, there's no problem. I don't know about you, but I've had people ask me, do you think this is sinful? Well, no, I don't think it's sinful. Okay, then good. And they're off to the races. No, wait a minute. There may be more involved in it not being sinful. If I understand Colossians 1, I'm understanding it this way, that here's some action, and even though it's not sinful, it may not be good judgment at all. Can I put my finger and say, it's not sinful? For example, marrying a non-Christian. Is it? Well, I can't prove it's a sin. In fact, I can show that it's right to be married to one in 1 Corinthians 7. But is that wise? No, that's not wise. So, understanding wisdom means that I know the difference between right and wrong, but I have good judgment too. It also means I know how to use knowledge. Knowledge is one thing, wisdom is something else. And I don't have time to develop each one of these categories. We'll just take the top one. I might know what the Word says. That's knowledge. Wisdom is how much information do I dish out in the class at the moment. Maybe I'm teaching a non-Christian and I overwhelm them with information. That's lack of wisdom. Did I do wrong? No, I didn't do wrong. I just may have overwhelmed them and kind of killed the class. Does that make sense? So how much do I teach? How much information do I give? That's the difference in knowledge and wisdom. Wisdom has to do with being able to see beyond the present, and that's how it's used in James 1 and verse 5. James 1 talks about how the benefit of trials and tribulation, the next thing he says is at verse 5, if any lack wisdom, let him ask of God. What's he talking about? Wisdom to see the good in the suffering at the moment. See, in the cloud of the persecution, you can't see beyond, this is going to be good for me. So wisdom has to do with being able to see beyond the present and see what the future holds. That's wisdom. So, let's talk about sources of wisdom. Where would you suggest he go? You can use the list or maybe suggest one or two yourself. Where would you suggest this guy goes who's a young man, says, I want to be wise so that when I'm appointed as an elder, I have some wisdom? Where would you tell him to go? I'd start with the Word of God, obviously. That's the greatest source of wisdom. Where else could he go and get wisdom? All right. He might talk to current serving elders or elders no longer serving who served before. That's not limited to the local church. That could be anywhere. I've had the advantage of traveling among brethren and staying with a lot of elders and eating with a lot of elders, and that gives me an opportunity at times, or did when I was doing meetings, to sit at their table. How would y'all deal with a scenario like this and propose something and hear their reaction? You gain a little wisdom, get a little insight. This is how they handled that. Doesn't mean it's right. This means that was their insight. Or we had a case like that, they say, and we dealt with that. And here's what I learned something from them. What else would you tell them? All right, that's good. I might suggest multitude of counselors. Doesn't have to be another elder. In the multitude of counselors, it may be a wise person in the congregation, may be an older sister, may be an older brother. Never served as an elder, but they've got wisdom. Might seek out their judgment, and they may pass on some wisdom to you. Just keep your ears open, and people will pass along wisdom that you never thought about being wisdom just by telling a story. And some of the gems of wisdom I've learned just by listening to some older preacher talk.
You can learn a lot about wisdom also by watching what people do wrong.
Yeah. And I think that's what the idea of experience, not here, but was it Laban who said to Jacob, I've learned by experience? You learn a lot by experience, indeed. All right, I want to quickly mention this because I want to get to the last one and then we're going to be done. He needs to spend some time praying. I would tell any man who wants to be an elder, spend some time praying because prayer is powerful. Summarize in one sentence what James 5 is telling us about the power of prayer. You tell me. Yeah, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. It does good. Prayer does good. It doesn't say it sometimes does good. It says it does good. It doesn't always hit the target I want, but it's going to do some good, and it accomplishes. So what does he need to pray for? I would encourage him to pray for yourself, for your growth in the area of leadership. I would tell him to pray for his family, to pray for wisdom. Help me gain wisdom. And so that person that gave you some advice that you really didn't want to hear, that might have been God's answer to your prayer for wisdom. God might be answering that Or that story, that long story that that brother told you, and it had a point to it, that might have been God's answer to you praying for wisdom. You might be supposed to have been learning from that. Pray about your attitude, about your right purpose and right motive and the opportunity to help people. And that'll go a long, long, long way. All right, let's go to our last point and we're going to be done. And this is in light of what we're going to announce and deal with come January 5. I would encourage you to listen to the perception of brethren. You want to be an elder? Listen to the perception of brethren. Now, the perception of brethren is important in selecting men to serve. Someone may quickly say in their mind, I really don't care what people think about me. If that's your attitude, you probably won't be selected as a potential elder. Probably not going to happen. Here's why. Acts 6 is the only passage I know of that lays out any kind of principle of selecting men to serve. You say that wasn't elders. I know it wasn't elders. Find another one. Find another passage where they were selected other than this principle of Acts 6. I don't know of one. Now, how was it done? Well, notice the brethren were told, do you seek out among you 7 men of good reputation and full of the Holy Spirit, etc., whom we may appoint over this business. And then the text says they, that is the brethren, chose who they chose. They chose these 7 men. And then the apostles, after they chose them, appointed them and laid their hands on them. Now, my point here is the brethren had to perceive that Stephen was a man that had a good reputation, didn't they? If their perception was he doesn't have a good reputation, would they have put him forward? No. So their perception of him had everything to do with his selection process. Does that make sense? All right. With that in mind, their perception could be wrong in either direction. Here's what I mean by that. They could think that you meet a qualification that you do not. Someone could put your name forward and say, I think this person is qualified, and I think he's got the ability to teach, and you may not have the ability to teach. Is that possible? I've seen that happen before. It could work in the opposite direction. Someone could think you don't meet a qualification that you actually do. So perceptions are important. Even if they're incorrect, they're important. Does that make sense? So what does that have to do with me? Your name may come forward in this 1 to 5 year or 5 to 10 year. Your name may come forward and somebody makes a suggestion about you that you could be if you changed X, Y, Z. What we're suggesting here is listen to what brethren say about you. If what they say is a misperception, they haven't perceived it correctly. If it's merely perception, then I need to think, if it's me, what could I do to correct that misperception? They think I'm not very social. I thought I was. What could I do to correct that misperception? Does that make sense? Because they're going to think I'm not associating with brethren and they can't. I'm not approachable is their perception. And so instead of getting upset, I need, why do they think that? Does that make sense? Listen to the misperception, even if it is one. If their perception is correct, then think what I can do to work on. They think I don't have the ability to teach. Well, why? Because I hadn't taught anything much. Well, then maybe I ought to agree to do some teaching so they can see that I have the ability to teach. What can I do to correct that? I do have that ability. I do meet that qualification, but they think not. Or maybe I don't meet that qualification. Then maybe I can work on that. Does that make sense? All right? And so you can't lead people who perceive that you're not a leader. Even if they're incorrect, it's hard. If they think you're not a leader, they're not going to listen to you. Now just think about that in another area. If you were convinced a man's not a preacher and that he can't preach and he can't preach well and he climbs in the pulpit, what have you done before he even gets started? Turned him off, hadn't you? You've turned him off. Kind of hard to teach people who think you can't teach. It's hard to lead people who think you can't lead. So my point here is perceptions are very, very important. Even if they're incorrect, they're important. Listen to those misperceptions. And elders will help work you through that. The current elders will help work you through that and work the congregation through those perceptions. Questions or comments? Our time is gone. Hopefully the series has been beneficial to you. Hopefully it accomplishes what we were wanting to accomplish. Genesis 1 and 2 next time.